There was a boy called Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it. His parents called him Eustace Clarence, and masters called him Scrubb. I can't tell you how his friends spoke to him, for he had none. He didn't call his father and mother father and mother, but Harold and Alberta. They were very up-to-date and advanced people. They were vegetarians, non-smokers, and teetotalers, and wore a special kind of underclothes. In their house there was very little furniture, and very few clothes on beds, and the windows were always open. Eustace Clarence liked animals, especially beetles, if they were dead and pinned on a card. He liked books, if they were books of information and had pictures of grain elevators or of fat foreign children doing exercises in model schools. Eustace Clarence disliked his cousins, the four Pevensies, Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy, but he was quite glad when he heard that Edmund and Lucy were coming to stay. For deep down inside him he liked bossing and bullying, and though he was a puny little person who couldn't have stood up even to Lucy, let alone Edmund in a fight, he knew that there are dozens of ways to give people a bad time if you are in your own home and they are only visitors. Thus begins The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, one of C.S. Lewis' beloved Chronicles of Narnia books. This story is the first to feature Eustace Clarence Scrubb, who just might be the most insufferably child about whom I've ever read. I realize this isn't a particularly articulate or academic description, but I'm not entirely sure he deserves one. Eustace is the sort of child who enjoys animals only if they're dead and prefers books in a similar condition. He uses big words to show off. He mocks anything he doesn't understand. He's curious about nothing, and here's the rub. When he is magically transported by God to another world through an oil painting of a majestic wooden ship, his only response is to sit on the deck of said ship, cry for like a really long time, and yell, let me go back, I don't like it." Upon meeting a talking mouse, Eustace refers to him as a horrid thing, and frequently demands that he be muzzled. When his cousin Lucy brings Eustace a magical cordial to cure him of seasickness, he calls it beastly stuff and refuses to say thank you, despite the fact that it cures him immediately and tastes delightful. He complains about the unfairness of chivalry. Lucy has been given the captain's quarters in which to lodge while he bunks with everyone else, and he continuously threatens to sue everyone if they don't take him to the nearest British consul. Something is deeply wrong with Eustace. Something is deeply wrong with humanity. Our world is full of Eustace Clarence Scrubbs, and many of them do in fact deserve the name. You see, Eustace is still a child. He may yet grow up differently than his trajectory suggests and be saved. But woe to the Eustace Clarence Scrubb who remains on the course I've just described. His character traits have transitioned from the obnoxious and bothersome to the wicked and sinful. His lack of adventure has become a lack of moral courage. He is of small soul and dull eyes, unable to be interested in anything, and thus unable to be interesting. But into what pit has he fallen? We certainly don't want to be scrubs of this sort, characterized by apathetic cowardice and doomed to a life of boredom. To learn of this scrub sickness and hopefully cure it, we must go back, as we always do, to Plato. As Lord Diggory, another Narnia character, says, it's all in Plato, all in Plato. Bless me, what do they teach them in these schools? Well, you're in luck, because at this school we teach Plato, so on we press. We will diagnose the scrub sickness, as it were, through the Republic. In Book 1 of the text, Socrates and his interlocutors begin a dialectical search into the nature of justice. This project proves difficult in its initial stages, with responses ranging from justice is speaking the truth and repaying one's debts, to justice is harming one's enemies and benefiting one's friends, to justice is nothing but the advantage of the stronger. With such varying definitions of justice and a seeming standstill on dialectical progress, the discussants develop a new strategy for finding justice in the soul. Socrates says, this investigation we're undertaking is not an easy one, but requires keen eyesight. Therefore, since we aren't clever people, we should adopt the method of investigation that we'd use if, lacking keen eyesight, we were told to read small letters from a distance, and then notice that the same letters existed elsewhere in a larger size and on a larger surface. We'd consider it a godsend, I think, to be allowed to read the larger ones first, and then to examine the smaller ones to see whether they really are the same. The search for justice has thus far proven fruitless. The discussants have been considering the individual man and his behavior, trying to decipher what makes a person just and what makes him unjust, but with little progress. So Socrates here suggests a problem-solving solution to relieve some of the difficulty. Instead of attempting to strain their intellectual eyes to see the small thing that is far away and difficult to discern, justice in the individual man, they will look for the same thing writ large elsewhere. If they can see justice in the big thing, it will ostensibly be the same as the justice in the smaller thing. So what is this large thing that looks like a giant human soul? The city. Cities are indeed much larger than individuals, and their parts are more easily defined. We can observe them and judge whether they are run well or poorly. We can discern which parts within them should govern and which parts should be governed. We can tell when one part is stepping out of line and causing dysfunction, and it's much easier to see specifically what is wrong with the city than to see specifically what is wrong with the individual. Thus, Socrates proposes, let's first find out what sort of thing justice is in a city, and afterwards look for it in the individual, observing the ways in which the smaller is similar to the larger. The rest of the dialogue flows from this jumping off point. We can see then that the city founded in the Republic is not a city in deeds, but in words. They're not trying to build a perfect city that will then actually instantiate into real life. They're crafting an image, a work of fiction. The interlocutors are together creating a person-like city, one that is made up of parts similar to the human soul, that function as the human soul ought, so that they can examine it and determine its justice. This text then is the perfect place to diagnose scrub sickness. Eustace presents a disorder of the soul. So as we consider the proper ordering of the soul in the Republic, I think the nature of his disorder will prove obvious. Socrates and his interlocutors divide the city up into three parts. The moneymakers do physical labor in order to provide goods and services to the city. The guardians are the ruling class, crafting laws and making decisions to keep the city on proper course. And the auxiliaries are a police force and standing army responsible for maintaining order in the city and protecting it from foreign threats. These parts of the city correspond directly with three parts of the human soul: the appetitive, the rational, and the spirited, respectively. Allow me to explain. The money-making part of the city is, as its name suggests, motivated by base desires. It seeks to provide itself with food, drink, and entertainment in order to satiate these desires and produces goods for the city out of this motivation. It is sheer need fulfillment that motivates the money-making section of the city. The appetitive part of the soul functions much in the same way. As an example, Socrates points out that the soul of the thirsty person, insofar as he's thirsty, doesn't wish anything else but to drink, and it wants this and is impelled towards it. And the appetitive part of the soul, then, does not make moral decisions. In fact, it doesn't decide anything at all. There's nothing right or wrong about my being thirsty. I'm just thirsty, or I'm not thirsty. The appetitive part of the soul then simply has desires and then seeks to fill them. This part can sometimes run contrary to reason, as the base desires one has do not always line up with what is reasonable for him to want. Socrates points out this distinction, saying, we'll call the part of the soul with which it calculates the rational part, and the part with which it lusts, hungers, thirsts, and gets excited by other appetites, the irrational appetitive part, companion of certain indulgences and pleasures. It's important to note that the appetitive part isn't so much contrary to reason as it is rational. It doesn't delineate or distinguish between its desires according to reason. It doesn't ask whether a desire is reasonable or not. The appetitive part just wants things. Often this is truly great. If we didn't have appetites, we might accidentally starve ourselves, not realizing that we are in need of food. It is only when these appetites run contrary to reason that they become dangerous. Appetites then, like the money-making class, don't need to be done away with, they just need to be ruled well. One would expect this rule to come from the guardians. These guardians are, after all, the part of the city that determines right from wrong, crafting laws and making decisions for the good of the whole. They, in this way, serve as both the legislators and the judges, providing the Republic with blueprints for proper ordering and functioning. It seems plausible enough that these guardians, who correspond with the rational part of the soul, are also responsible for keeping proper control of the appetites. That is, unless you've ever tried to go on a diet, or go to the gym consistently, or read regularly. You see, we tend to know the proper course of action far more frequently than we follow it. When my appetites tell me I want a cookie, I want a cookie, no matter how much I know it's a bad idea. When I want to take a nap after work, I want to take that nap, no matter how much I know I should be grading. My knowledge of the proper course of action does very little to curb my appetites.
The rational part doesn't have the capacity to both make proper judgments and keep hold of the appetites. Reason can only do so much. This is why, in the city Socrates and friends are building, the guardians, or the rational part, rely on the auxiliaries to police the people and carry out the will of the guardians. The auxiliaries in the city keep tabs on the moneymakers and enforce the laws passed down from the guardians. As Socrates says, we made the auxiliaries in our city like dogs obedient to the rulers, who are themselves like shepherds of a city. While the shepherds decide when and where the herd will move, the shepherds' dogs communicate those decisions to the sheep and ensure that they do what they should be doing. Similarly, though the guardians are responsible for making the city's decisions and providing it with direction, the auxiliaries are responsible for enforcing the guardians' rulings in the money-making class. Beyond this, the auxiliaries also serve as the city's military. They are called upon to defend the whole republic from foreign threats, stepping into battle as the primary defense against external aggression. In both of these roles, as the police force over the moneymakers and as the military defense from foreign threats, the auxiliaries correspond with the spirited part of the person. Now, the spirited part of the soul may be less immediately familiar to us than the other two we've discussed so far, and the nature of it is such that it's difficult to describe. It's something like the strength of the will, the part of us that gets angry and spurs on action. It's the source of love, not erotic love, but the love that lays down his life for his friends. It's that full feeling in your chest as you perform a heroic deed. It's the fire that burns in you when you witness a friend getting hurt. The spirited part is so difficult to describe because it's somehow below reason, but higher than erotic emotion. It sits between the two, protecting the soul against threats, both within and without, just like the auxiliaries. It works as our soul's police force, as Socrates describes. We often notice in other cases that when appetite forces someone contrary to rational calculation, he reproaches himself and gets angry with that in him that's doing the forcing. So that of the two factions that are fighting a civil war, so to speak, spirit allies itself with reason. The spirited part hands down the decrees of the rational and enforces them, demanding command over the appetitive part and enforcing that demand through its own strength. It is, moreover, our soul's standing army. Socrates points this out too, saying that if a person believes that someone has been unjust to him, the spirit within him is boiling and angry, fighting for what he believes to be just. It will endure hunger and cold and the like, and keep on till it is victorious, not ceasing from noble actions until it either wins, dies, or calms down, called to heel by the reason within him. The spirited part protects the soul by fighting injustice, both within and without, as a burning fire that blazes on in the name of reason. As the spirit goes, then, so goes the whole soul. In a properly ordered city, the guardians rule over the moneymakers through the auxiliaries. Justice is present if these relationships are in their proper balance. Justice in the soul, then, comes when the rational part rules over the appetitive part through the strength of the spirited part. So again, rational part rules over the appetitive part through the spirited part. When these things are in proper order, the soul is healthy and functions well. Reason rules the appetites, deciding which ones are meant to be filled and in what way. These appetites will naturally surge after whatever it is that they want, so it's then up to the spirit to keep control over them and allow them or disallow them from the things they desire. The spirited part allying itself with the rational part is of the utmost importance to the overall justice of the soul. The scrub sickness, then, being an illness of a soul, must have something to do with the arrangements of these parts. It seems unlikely that Scrub has a just soul, given his continuous unjust behavior. Moreover, it seems unlikely that his spirited part has allied itself with the appetitive part, turning him into some sort of beast man. He doesn't go after his desires with much passion and strength. He mostly just whines and snivels, like a little lump. Still further, Scrub doesn't seem to be utterly at war with the rational part within himself. After all, he seems to care a lot about facts and figures and stuff. So, I believe that Eustace Clarence Scrubb's problem is in fact that he has little to no spirit. The part of him that is meant to feel things rightly and spur him on to courageous action seems to be strangely missing. Instead, we're left with a hollow sort of child, devoid of real passion or will. Why is he this way, and how do we help him? Thankfully, this is in Plato too. Lord Diggory seems wiser by the moment. Education in the city is the foremost topic of conversation in the Republic. And since we know that the spirited part of the soul corresponds to the auxiliaries in the city, the pedagogy prescribed to these auxiliaries may be helpful in writing a prescription for Scrubb's lack of spirit, and explain how it came about. The education of the auxiliaries is not focused on memorizing facts and repeating platitudes. It is not about knowing what to do in a given situation, or possessing proper knowledge of virtue. This is not the role of auxiliaries, and to educate them with arguments and reasons makes little sense. They are meant to be two things: strong and allied with the guardians, no matter what. As such, the education of the auxiliaries is a largely emotional education that seeks to bind them to what is good, true, and beautiful at an intrinsic level. This is accomplished through stories, music, and poetry. Stories work to this end when they are the right kind of stories. Socrates and the interlocutors set out an extensive list of things stories should celebrate in order to properly educate the auxiliaries. The stories should teach them to honor the gods and their parents and not take their friendship with one another lightly. They must inculcate a love for tradition and for community, building up the auxiliaries' affection in those areas rather than stifling them or calling them into question. The stories must celebrate courage and make them least afraid of death. In this way, when the auxiliaries face danger, they will do so bravely, like the heroes of the myths they know and love. The auxiliaries are told stories that celebrate moderation. They are thus trained to obey the rulers and to rule the pleasures of drink, sex, and food for themselves. The auxiliaries hear stories that celebrate justice and show how by nature it profits the one who has it, whether he is believed to be just or not. In so doing, these stories encourage the auxiliaries to always be just, regardless of circumstance. The stories auxiliaries hear train them in virtue, teaching them piety, friendship, courage, moderation, justice. The music and poetry chosen for the auxiliaries' education seek the same ends. Socrates and the interlocutors reject music and poetry that encourage laziness and impiety or immoderation, choosing instead the sort of musical modes and metrical styles that build up courage in the auxiliaries' hearts. Just as the auxiliaries are utterly shaped by this sort of education, so is the human spirit shaped by the stories, poetry, and music that we imbibe from a young age. Let us refer to this sort of education as spirit education, just for the purposes of this talk. Not to be confused with spiritual education, but spirit education. I say this because it's literally the education of the spirited part of the soul. So it's not a very technical term, but it's what we're using. This spirit education relies not on a knowledge and proper understanding of facts, but instead on establishing the proper feelings that lead towards virtue. Stories, music, and poetry are unique mediums to communicate this sort of truth. These art forms linger in the human moral imagination, providing it with an unspoken set of basic moral principles. It is often difficult for one to articulate precisely why she should be like Cinderella and not one of her stepsisters, but she nevertheless feels the truth of this statement with obvious force. The stories, music, and poetry a child loves will unconsciously shape her spirit for good or for bad. They seek deep into this part of her soul, informing her actions and either helping or hindering her path to virtue. If the stories a child knows and loves celebrate virtue and condemn vice, her spirit will be ready to align with her reason in the civil war against her appetites. It is through story, through music, through poetry, that the spirit is won to the side of reason. In this way, it will fulfill its proper function, curbing the appetites to align with reason, rendering the well-formed person capable of performing virtuous action. It's clear, then, how Eustace Clarence Scrubb has gone wrong. He's received a sterile, unfeeling education from his parents, or should I say Harold and Alberta, and from his modern school. I think it's called the Experimental School. The Experiment House, yeah, that's what it is. No, you're fine. The spirit education necessary to develop his full soulish faculties has been ignored in favor of enlightened ideas and the educational zeitgeist of the era. He's a child without childlikeness, deprived of wonder by the way he's been taught to engage with the world. The health of his soul depends on a real education, one that addresses both the rational and the spirited parts. The Voyage of the Dawn Treader serves as a spirit education for those with scrub sickness, and the rational part of this education comes to us from earlier in Lewis's career. Lewis gives The Abolition of Man as a set of lectures at King's College, Newcastle in 1943, some 9 years before the publishing of Dawn Treader. In it, he bemoans the state of modern education and its lack of concern for the spirit. He quotes from a grammar text called the Green Book, in which the authors discuss a dispute at the waterfall, namely whether it is pretty or sublime. The Green Book answers as such. You guys ready for this? This is truly terrible. When the man said, "This is sublime," he appeared to be making a remark about the waterfall. Actually, he was not making a remark about the waterfall, but a remark about his own feelings. What he was saying was really, I have feelings associated in my mind with the word sublime. Or shortly, I have sublime feelings. This confusion is continually present in language as we use it. We appear to be saying something very important about something, and actually we are only saying something about our own feelings. This all too common transfer of qualitative judgments from the objective to the subjective has, in effect, hamstrung our system of spirit education. In arguing that all reactions to beauty are merely in our feelings, we've done two things. First, in saying that our reactions to beauty are merely in our feelings, we have said that there is no right and wrong way to view the world. There's no difference between the man who finds delight in the rose and the man who finds delight in a mangled corpse. This is ludicrous. It is good and right for one to take delight in the beauty of a flower. It is perverse and wrong to take delight in the image of a mangled corpse. I'm not even going to defend these statements because the fact that they could even possibly need a defense is a severe indictment of our culture. If Plato is correct about the role of the spirit, then us feeling rightly about things is paramount to our virtue. We need a system of education that helps rouse the student's spirit to the right things and dissuade it from the wrong things. The Green Book ignores the categories of right and wrong feeling altogether, placing the spirit in a decidedly amoral place. But if our spirits are amoral, they will not side with reason, and this is dangerous indeed. If our spirit is roused by the wrong things, it will be won away from reason and throw the soul out of balance. We need an educated spirit, which means we need to acknowledge that there are right and wrong feelings. Second, in saying that our reactions to beauty are merely in our feelings, we have heavily implied that our feelings are trivial things, unimportant for consideration in educational theory. The education of the spirit is sacrificed on the altar of reason, despite the fact that reason has requested no such sacrifice. If virtuous action, if wisdom and courage and moderation and justice require the alliance of well-formed reason and a strong spirit, then neither the education of the rational part nor the education of the spirit can be ignored. This well-educated spirit, one who loves the right things and allies itself to them, will lead to a just and virtuous soul, enabling students to flourish and be happy. One with an uneducated spirit will find difficulty being brave in the face of adversity. His appetitive desire to flee danger or pain will overthrow reason and be made manifest unless he possesses a strong spirit allied to reason that fights his base desires and spurs him on to virtue. For every Samwise Gamgee who challenges a giant spider and hurls out, "Let him go, you filth! Let him go! You will not touch him again!" there is a Denethor who sets himself aflame because he thinks Sauron too powerful to be resisted. One with an educated spirit will find difficulty in sacrificing for what is right. He lacks the burning within his chest that will not betray what is good, even at the cost of his own comfort, health, or life. For every serious black who would have died rather than betray his friends, there's a Peter Pettigrew who will snivel and writhe like a rat to avoid pain, selling out his friends' lives and his own soul to save his hide. Because we want to be a school where virtue thrives and vice is trod underfoot. Because we want our students to leave here prepared to be decent men and women, no matter how indecent the times may become. Because we think that the school that ignores virtue formation can hardly be called a school at all. Because we believe that people are more than their ideas. We read fairy tales. Fairy tales, based on their very nature, are the ideal curriculum for spirit education. Just as the spirit is strangely positioned between reason and appetite in the soul, so is the fairy tale strangely positioned within the world of literature. They are not fantasy, as Chesterton says. Compared with them, other things are fantastic. They follow a strict code of law and are bound to it utterly. They are also not what we'd call non-fictional. They're quite distant from the world in which we live. They are too poetic to be prose and too prosaic to be poetry. They're not heavenly, but they certainly aren't earthly either. They do not make arguments, but are also not devoid of them. The fairy tale stands arranged like the spirit, ever mediating between our reason and our appetites. Thus, it is the perfect tool for spirit education. It performs this function in two major ways. One, fairy tales are engaged with by the spirit rather than by reason. And two, fairyland is constructed with reason and morality as its only law. What does it mean for a piece of literature to be engaged with the spirit rather than reason? This is a curious thing to say about a work composed of words. And George MacDonald, intellectual forefather to C.S. Lewis, anticipates this difficulty and responds to it in his essay, The Fantastic Imagination. I want to read a rather large portion of a paragraph from this essay to you because George MacDonald is way more qualified to talk to you about this than I am. So we're just going to read a good chunk of what he says because it's awesome. It's very seldom indeed that words carry the exact meaning of any user of them. And if they can be so used as to convey definite meaning, it does not follow that they ought never to carry anything else. Words are live things that may be variously employed to various ends. They can convey a scientific fact, or throw a shadow of her child's dream on the heart of a mother. They are things to put together like the pieces of a dissected map, or to arrange like the notes on a stave. Is the music in them to go for nothing? It can hardly help the definiteness of a meaning. Is it therefore to be disregarded? They have length and breadth and outline. Have they nothing to do with depth? Have they only to describe, never to impress? Has nothing any claim to their use but the definite? The cause of a child's tears may be altogether undefinable. Has the mother therefore no antidote for his vague misery? That may be strong in color which has no evident outline. A fairy tale, a sonata, a gathering storm, a limitless night, seizes you and sweeps you away. Fairy tales, like all good art, cannot be easily explained, but can be easily felt. The fairy tale, like a painting or a concerto, is not created in order to communicate propositional truth. That's why this talk is not simply a list of virtues that you might learn from reading fairy tales. Snow White, Cinderella, Beauty and the Beast, Little Mermaid. Of course, those stories will teach you moral lessons. But they certainly don't do it because they have a neat little wrap-up at the end. No one was ever really convinced of the importance of virtue by reading an interpretation of a fairy tale that gives its lesson and reduces it down to an easy-to-memorize aphorism. No, it's the effect of the tale as a whole, the emotional climate in which the tale baptizes the whole soul, which gets at the true nature of the fairy tale. And it is because of this that fairy tales are such potent tools for spirit education. How do you teach the part of the student that can't learn by words alone? Fairy tales are an answer, and in my estimation, a very good one. They are works of art that create an emotional landscape that the hearer of the tale can explore. This emphasis on experience and impression is why fairy tales are so effective at reaching the spirit. They are good at teaching it, however, not due to this emphasis alone, but due to their content. Now wait a minute. Didn't I just say that fairy tales weren't especially focused on aphorisms or arguments or words? So content? I'd submit that in a work that relies not on argument, but on exploration of another world, it is the makeup of this world that determines the content of the work. Fairy tales take place in fairyland, and as far as I can tell, fairyland is bound by only two rules. The first, which G.K. Chesterton points out in his work Orthodoxy, is that fairyland must be rational. The laws of reason hold in fairyland just as they do anywhere else. If the wicked stepmother is Cinderella's stepmother, then Cinderella must be her stepdaughter. This is a rule of logic. What doesn't hold in fairyland, however, are scientific laws. As Chesterton points out, we have always in our fairy tales kept a sharp distinction between the science of mental relations, in which there really are laws, and the science of physical facts, in which there are no laws, only weird repetitions. In fairyland, wolves' stomachs can hold 2 whole people without much discomfort. Birds can talk when they need to warn you of danger, and ringing a bell when you're told not to will wake an evil queen and bring evil to the land. None of these things are irrational, they just don't happen very often in our world. I say very often, probably sometimes. Instead, we experience bizarre phenomena like things falling every time you let go of them, apples growing on trees, sounds rising in pitch as they travel towards you. These things are just as bizarre as those that occur in fairyland. We're just used to them. Ultimately, then, fairyland provides a clearer distinction between the rational and irrational. That which holds in both our world and in fairyland tends to be rational. That which shocks us in fairyland is often only as shocking as the curious things that happen here. The absence of our scientific law in fairyland, however, opens it up to fairyland's second type of law, that which, together with rational law, helps inform our sensibilities as we explore fairyland. I'm speaking, of course, of moral law. This law remains rigid in fairyland, and as it often replaces scientific law in the place, it shines perhaps more clearly there than it does here. As MacDonald writes, it were no offense to suppose a world in which everything repelled instead of attracting the things around it. It would be wicked to write a tale representing a man it called good as always doing bad things, or a man it called bad as always doing good things. The notion itself is absolutely lawless. This moral law, which rules in fairyland alongside reason, appears with shocking clarity when not muddled by the complexity of our world. Fairyland is a simple place, and ruled by simple rules, and therein lies its beauty. That which is logically necessary remains logically necessary. That which is morally necessary remains morally necessary. Everything else is free to the imagination of the author. But as it turns out, the exploration of this simple place is exactly what the spirited part of our nature needs. The perfect place to learn to love goodness and hate wickedness is a place where good is good and bad is bad. There are no gray areas or places of moral uncertainty in fairyland. Is it good to eat little children? No. Not even if you're a giant or a really lonely witch. Should we feel sorry for the really lonely witch because she's hungry and really lonely? No. She's eating children. I will pause here to lodge a complaint with Disney. In recent years, especially with Frozen, which is an abominable excuse for a fairy tale film, we're watching it in our class anyway, but truly awful. Disney seems to have utterly forgotten its roots in order to bow to the trend of tragic backstory that reframes a villain as simply misunderstood. Ugh. The fairy tale is as effective as it is, largely due to the simplicity of its moral code. It functions and thrives on clear moral laws that govern fairyland. If the purpose of the fairy tale is to educate the spirit, as I contend that it is, then muddying the waters between good and evil can only succeed in muddying the moral clarity of the audience's spirit. This seems to be an exceptionally wicked thing to do. The whole goal of the fairy tale is to form the spirit through a baptism in clear moral truth, governed by the dictates of reason. We have enough media and literature that shows us how complicated the world is. Keep it out of our fairy tales. Anyway, sorry, that's my Disney complaint. The moral truths of fairy tales don't require syllogisms or complex arguments to be understood, but it takes a good deal of time dwelling with them before they are truly felt. Through interacting with fairy tales time and again, the spirited part of our nature takes to the moral truths of fairyland and adopts them as its own. In this way, through interacting with fairyland, a place ruled by right and reason, the spirit learns to love what is good and hate what is evil, to fight for virtue and battle down vice. Fairy tales are essential to this end, as moral truths cannot be felt with any degree of force by mere argument. The spirit is an emotional part of the soul and requires an emotional education in order to learn to love what it ought. And if the spirit does not learn to love what it ought, it will not fulfill its proper function. The appetites of man are voracious and volatile. They cannot be reined in by reason alone. One needs a strong spirit to fight his own vice, to develop a virtuous character. We must tell ourselves, tell our children, story after story after story, of brave maidens and clever princes, of talking wolves and mischievous pixies, of pain and redemption and grace and sacrifice. We must learn to love the best things, that we might flourish and do well, as Eustace does once he receives a real education. The fairy story will save us, if our spirits are persuaded by it. Thank you.